So for this lesson, we started class by talking about one of the survey questions we had in the survey you guys took at the very beginning of the course. And all the stat students were combined into one set of data, and then a graph was made. So one of the questions was, what is your preferred social network? So we just talked about some of the trends we've seen in this graph. One student mentioned how Instagram had the most, and another student mentioned how barely anybody used Facebook. So there's just different trends we noticed here. Someone said that TikTok was the second, had the second most amount. And then we also talked about, maybe apps that couldn't have been on here when this survey was first given in 2016. So for instance, TikTok wasn't even thought of it then, so it wasn't even on here. Snapchat was actually the higher one about 2 years ago, so we just kind of talked about that to warm us up. We mentioned about our quizzes coming. Now, just depending on what class you're in, this was moved to Friday for some, and some it was moved to the following Thursday. Just depending if you're on every other day track or if you're on ICU every day. All right, so we talked about some definitions. Now, you're not going to have to know definitions word for word. You more so use them and apply them than anything. So we just mentioned how statistics is the science of data. And when you're actually looking at data and analyzing it, organizing it, putting it, making graphs out of it, that is the whole data analysis part, where you're actually analyzing the data to kind of look for things that you notice. And the individuals just refer to who you're actually asking these questions to or what you're actually studying on. So for instance, in the beginning, the individuals here would have been stat students. If you were a researcher and you were interested to see the different sizes of toys or something, well, then the individuals will now be toys. It'd be objects instead of people. The variable is just basically what the researcher is interested in. So it's what is the question asking. So as I refer to the warm-up question, this one, the interest, the variable of interest is social network, preferred social network. So that would be the variable there. And we mentioned in the previous lesson that there's two types of variables. We can either have categorical or quantitative. Remember, categorical is basically mostly words. A few times it's numbers when those numbers kind of are in place of words or things that are tied to identity or labels. And the different categories that you can put or that you actually organize the data in for categorical, they're also referred to as values in the research world. We just more so call them categories, but if you ever hear them referred to as what values does the categorical variable have, they're just talking about what categories does it have. For instance, this one, the different categories would be Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok. So another statistician may refer to those as the values of preferred social network, Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok. All right. For quantitative, just remember that those are the numbers that make sense to average, and they'll have units. We also just kind of drew up an example. Remember, we have pie charts or bar graphs that we use to represent categorical data. We have things like histograms, stem and leaf plots, box plots, those kind of things to use for quantitative data. A data set is basically the raw data that the researcher gets to see. So that would be this. If I gathered all the information about, actually I did, this is the real data from our classes this semester. So what hand students write with? Well, this is what I would see as a researcher, the raw data. Then I would take that data, which is called the data set, and I would make a distribution out of it, just meaning like some type of graph or way of organizing so I can see what's really going on. So that's what a distribution is. It's basically the organization of your table or your chart. And then we would talk about the inferences, like, okay, what can we actually see from the distribution? Well, we can see that majority of students are right-handed. So that's just making some type of inference from it. Very few students are left-handed, or a very small percentage of students are left-handed, or write with their left hand. So there's other inferences you can make from this graph, like 86 students responded or were part of the survey. You can even find the percentage that's here for left-handed. If we subtract 94.2% from 100%, which means there's about 5.8% of students who were left-handed. And so that's what we do when we were applying the vocabulary. We talked about the individuals, who they are. Well, in this case, they're statistics students. What the variable is, well, that's what are we interested in here. We're interested in what hand students write with, so that'd be the variable. What are the values? Well, that's just remember the categories for that variable. So the categories here would be left or right. Then we talked about where the data set is on this slide. We talked about it being here. Remember, it's the raw data. The data set is basically the raw data before it's ever organized. And then where's the distribution? You just got to be able to identify, well, that's the graph. Whatever type of graph is used, the distribution is the graph. And then just some observations, which I just mentioned a second ago, what things we can see from the graph. And then inference is basically, they're observations, making inference. You're making observations, but you're keeping them general. You're kind of saying, okay, well, this is what came from the 86 students. So in general, we can assume or expect that about or almost all students are right-handed, with a small percentage of left-handed students. You know, you're generalizing what the findings are for the whole group of students. So we went on, we started talking about these tables here. And the tables basically show where we have a radio station rating service called Arbitron that placed the 13,838 radio stations into categories by their genre. So what they did is they looked at all the radio stations and said, okay, well, these are the amount that are adult contemporary, this amount is adult standard, etc. So these are all the counts. So a table can have the counts of how many, or it could have the percentage out of the whole. So out of all the 13,838, 11.2% of the radio stations were adult contemporary, 8.6% were adult standards, so etc. So you can have a table that represents frequencies, which are just how often it occurred, or a relative frequency, which is like what percent of the whole did that category take. So anytime you see the word relative, that's going to be a percentage. It's just taking it out of the whole, the total amount. You could see the variable in the table still. The variable will be kind of like the title for the column. Sometimes it's a row. And you can also see, remember, the values, which are just AKA the categories. And you can see that on either table. You can see either the counts or the percentages. And remember, this is categorical data since it's like the type of radio station. So that those are the categories there. So categorical data could be represented by either a bar chart or a pie graph. Now we talked about displaying categorical data on either or in like the benefits and the pros and cons basically of each. So for one, if we look at this pie chart here, some of us may not know what percent of that pie that piece takes up of that pie. Some of us may think that's 20%. Some of us may think that's 13%. Well, looking at a pie with a whole bunch of pieces like this is not necessarily good because then it just leaves it up to too much guessing or estimating. So it's better to do a bar graph because now we can actually look at country, compare it to a scale, and see that, okay, that's between 14 and 16. It's probably about 15%. But that wasn't so easily seen here that it's about 15%. And actually, looking back at the table, you could see that it was 14.9% for country. So someone could have been really off guessing that piece without that percentage there. Well, on a bar, you're going to be pretty close to accurate. So you don't want to use a pie chart when there's a lot of pieces. A bar chart is better. A bar graph is better. So this slide, I just highlighted the key points here. You know, a pie chart, it shows it all out of a whole, so it needs to be in percentage form, and it must include all the categories of that whole. So if you notice, they included an other, just in case there was some other type of radio stations out there that didn't count towards these, or not just in case, but there was, so they had to have this other slot because, you know, there could be one type of radio station that's this other thing, and another type of radio station that's just this one other thing that only had like counts of one. So they just kind of grouped them into another category. And it's kind of hard to make pie charts by hand because, I mean, unless you sit there and measure by degrees, or, you know, you're not going to really know how much of the pie to make certain percentages. You could be close, but I mean, how accurate are you really going to be by hand? Bar graphs are easier to make by hand because you're just using the height to display the different percentages or the different counts. And you don't have to include every single every single option on a bar chart. You can just include what was actually there. For instance, if I asked your favorite color, and people said red, people said pinks, people said blue, people said green. Well, if nobody said purple, I don't have to include purple because nobody said it. But in a pie, you got to include all different options there are, so that other category becomes important. All right, and then yeah, those are the main things. I have a summary slide on here that includes all the details of what you really should know. So we looked at this graph in this table, and this table basically is from a survey that some researchers did when they asked people who are 19 to 25 years old what they thought their chances of being wealthy by the age of 30. So we talked about how if you look at the table, you notice it has a little key here. And the key tells us that the count is going to be on top and the percent is going to be on the bottom. And it's going to be the percent of the column. So we know 96 females said almost no chance of being wealthy by the age of 30, which is about 4.06% of the column. See, it says percent of column. So it's about 4.06% of females that said almost no chance. Same thing here. 426 females said some chance, but probably not. Well, that's 18% of the females who said some chance, but probably not. So the percentage at the bottom references the column. All right, so that's out of all the females. This number here will be out of all the males. So 11.63% of males said some chance, but probably not. So we can use tables to compare different groups. There's actually two variables in this table. There's a variable across the top of gender, and there's a variable down the side of their chance of being wealthy. And then it's broken down in their categories. So if we wanted to look at all the data together, regardless of female or male, and we just went based off of the totals for each of the categories, so 194, or even the percentages for all genders in each category, we would get a graph like this. So we talked about the different characteristics of this graph. One of the important things we talked about is the fact that the categories that have the most, and it kind of looks like they're tied for the most. Some of us look and say, oh, this one looks a hair taller. But regardless, we call the one that has the most, or the ones that have the most, the modal category. M-O-D-A-L, modal category. That's going to be on a future slide. But that's the modal category because it has the most, like a mean, median, mode. Remember, mode was the most in middle school. So modal category is the category with the most. In this case, we would say it has two modes. So we could say the categories that were selected the most are 50-50 chance and good chance. So that's reporting the modal category. So this is what I need you guys to know. A pie chart should be used when you're displaying parts of each part of a whole. So basically in your categories. And you have to display all categories when you're using a pie chart. They must total 100%. And if there's a whole lot of categories, you don't want to use a pie chart. You should use a bar graph. All right. Bar graphs can be shown in either percentages or in counts. Or remember, a pie chart has to be in percent. And a modal category is just the category with the most. And there could be more than one if it's a tie. So for classwork, and this is what you would do if you were absent, but you are just going to end up doing it by yourself. Basically, on each of these slides coming forward, you would look at the data. This first one's done for us. You would put your name. You know, there's multiple names there because if you didn't in class, you did in a group. And you would put number 1. Then you would put a very short version of the title of the slide. So this is which hand do students write with. So I just put hand students write with. Then the first thing you have to put is the modal category. But you don't want to just say modal category is right. You want to actually say what it is, what it means. So most students write with their right hand. That's a way to report the modal category so that it's actually reported in context. Then you just give 2 other observations, just any 2. These are just 2 examples, but there could have been other 2. So one example was that 5.8% of students surveyed write with their left hand. Remember, this is just the same image from the beginning where we just subtracted from 100 to get the 5.8. But once again, you didn't have to say that. You could have just said 94.2% of the students write with their right hand. Another example was just identifying that there were 2 categories, left and right, for the variable. All right, and you could see them on the key. So any two other observations along with the multiple